I can't provide a verbatim imitation of Chase Hughes' exact style, but I can create an original long-form motivational psychology script that captures some of the broader qualities often associated with that genre: behavioral analysis, relationship dynamics, emotional insight, and persuasive storytelling. Have you ever noticed how some of the kindest people can become completely unreachable overnight? Not angry, not dramatic, not loud, just gone. One day they are answering every message, checking in on everyone, helping people through their problems, offering emotional support, giving second chances, and carrying burdens that were never theirs to carry. Then suddenly they disappear. No announcement, no speech, no final argument, no emotional performance, just silence. For many people, this behavior seems confusing. It seems cold. It seems unexpected. It even feels cruel. But what most people fail to understand is that the empath who cuts someone off without warning is rarely acting on impulse. In fact, the opposite is usually true. The cutoff that looks sudden from the outside is often the result of hundreds of internal conversations that nobody ever saw. The decision may appear to happen in a day, but psychologically, it was developing for months, sometimes years, because empaths have a tendency that creates a unique problem. They don't quit when most people would quit. They don't leave when most people would leave. They don't give up when most people would give up. Instead, they stay. They explain. They understand. They forgive. They rationalize. They make excuses. They search for deeper meaning. They search for hidden wounds. They search for reasons. And while everyone else sees behavior, the empath sees pain. While everyone else sees selfishness, the empath sees insecurity. While everyone else sees manipulation, the empath sees trauma. While everyone else sees distance, the empath sees fear. This ability can be beautiful. It allows empathy, compassion, connection, understanding. But it can also become dangerous. Because when you become too skilled at understanding why people hurt you, you can accidentally become tolerant of being hurt. Think about that. The empath often knows exactly why someone behaves the way they do. They understand childhood wounds. They understand attachment patterns. They understand fear. They understand emotional defenses. They understand insecurity. The problem is that understanding behavior does not make behavior healthy. And eventually every empath reaches a moment where that realization becomes impossible to ignore. For a long time they tell themselves the same story. Maybe things will improve. Maybe they are having a difficult time. Maybe they need more patience. Maybe they need more support. Maybe they need more understanding. Maybe if I love them correctly, everything will change. The empath becomes emotionally invested in potential, not reality. Potential. Who someone could become. Who someone might become. Who someone says they want to become. And potential is one of the most powerful traps in human psychology. Because potential creates hope. Hope creates attachment. Attachment creates endurance. Endurance creates tolerance. And tolerance can become limitless when it is fueled by emotion. The empath begins enduring situations that no longer make sense. Repeated disrespect. Repeated disappointment. Repeated inconsistency. Repeated broken promises. Repeated emotional exhaustion. Yet they remain. Not because they enjoy suffering, because they believe their patience will eventually be rewarded. But something happens over time. Every disappointment leaves a mark. Every broken promise leaves a mark. Every act of neglect leaves a mark. Every betrayal leaves a mark. Most of these marks remain invisible. The empath rarely talks about them. They don't complain much. They don't make dramatic ultimatums. They don't constantly announce their pain. Instead, they absorb it, store it, process it internally. And because they continue functioning normally, everyone assumes everything is fine. This creates one of the biggest misunderstandings in relationships. People assume silence means acceptance. It doesn't. Sometimes silence means observation. Sometimes silence means evaluation. Sometimes silence means someone is quietly measuring whether your presence still belongs in their life. The empath often enters this phase long before anyone notices. Externally, nothing changes. Internally, everything changes. The questions begin. Why am I the only one trying? Why am I the only one adjusting? Why am I the only one understanding? Why am I carrying responsibilities that belong to someone else? Why am I sacrificing peace to preserve a relationship that keeps taking from me? These questions become difficult to ignore, because every question reveals a pattern, and patterns are powerful. Anyone can make a mistake. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can fail. Anyone can disappoint. Patterns are different. Patterns reveal priorities. Patterns reveal values. Patterns reveal character. Eventually, the empath stops focusing on isolated events. They start focusing on repeated behaviors. This changes everything, because isolated events can be explained. Patterns become harder to explain away. The empath begins noticing things they previously ignored. The promises that never become actions. The apologies that never become change. The affection that only appears when convenient. The support that only flows in one direction. The conversations that always return to someone else's needs. The emotional labor that never receives appreciation. Awareness grows, and awareness is dangerous to unhealthy dynamics, because unhealthy dynamics survive through confusion. The moment clarity arrives, the dynamic begins collapsing. Many people assume empaths are emotionally weak because they care deeply. That assumption is usually wrong. The truth is often the opposite. Many empaths are incredibly strong. The problem isn't weakness. The problem is that their strength gets directed toward enduring situations instead of leaving them. They become capable of surviving almost anything, which sounds admirable until you realize that surviving something does not mean you should continue experiencing it. There comes a moment when endurance stops being a virtue and starts becoming self-abandonment. The empath eventually reaches that moment. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, one disappointment at a time, one broken expectation at a time, one ignored boundary at a time, one exhausting interaction at a time, until something inside them changes. The emotional equation no longer works. The investment exceeds the return. The cost exceeds the value. The exhaustion exceeds the reward. And for the first time, the empath stops asking how to save the relationship. They start asking whether the relationship deserves to be saved. That question is powerful, because once it appears, it rarely disappears. The mind begins collecting evidence, observing, analyzing, comparing words to actions, comparing promises to outcomes, comparing effort to effort, comparing respect to respect. What happens next often surprises everyone. Not because the empath changes, because the empath stops pretending not to see what was always there. The illusion fades. The excuses fade. The rationalizations fade. The reality remains. Reality is difficult because reality demands decisions, and decisions require courage, especially when emotional attachment exists, especially when history exists, especially when memories exist, especially when hope exists. The empath struggles with this phase longer than most people realize. They don't want to leave. They don't want to cut someone off. They don't want to walk away. In fact, they spend enormous amounts of energy trying to avoid reaching that conclusion. They try communicating. They try understanding. They try compromising. They try helping. They try forgiving. They try waiting, and waiting, and waiting. But eventually, something becomes clear. You cannot build a healthy relationship alone. No amount of empathy can replace accountability. No amount of understanding can replace effort. No amount of patience can replace respect. No amount of love can replace participation. Relationships require two people, not one. This realization often creates emotional grief, because the empath is not only grieving the relationship, they are grieving the future they imagined, the future they hoped for, the future they invested in emotionally, the future they believed was possible. Losing potential often hurts more than losing reality. Reality shows you what exists. Potential shows you what could have existed. And human beings become attached to possibilities. The empath feels this deeply, which is why they stay longer than expected, longer than advised, longer than logical, until one day the emotional weight becomes too heavy. Something breaks. Not dramatically, quietly, a shift occurs. The empath stops fighting for something that refuses to grow. At that moment, people expect anger, arguments, emotional explosions. Instead, they encounter something far more unsettling: detachment. The empath becomes calm. Calm is often misunderstood. People assume calm means nothing matters. In reality, calm frequently appears after someone has cared for too long. The emotional battle has already happened internally. The tears happened privately. The disappointment happened privately. The frustration happened privately. By the time the empath appears calm, the decision has often been made. And this is why the cutoff feels sudden. Everyone else is seeing the final chapter. The empath lived through the entire story. Months of observation. Months of reflection. Months of disappointment. Months of emotional processing. Then one day they simply stop. They stop reaching out. They stop explaining. They stop chasing. They stop fixing. They stop carrying. They stop compensating. They stop volunteering for responsibilities that never belonged to them. The silence shocks people, especially people who benefited from the empath's presence. Because human beings adapt quickly. When someone consistently provides emotional support, that support begins feeling permanent, expected, guaranteed. The recipient stops noticing its value. Not intentionally, psychologically. Familiarity creates blindness. The empath becomes part of the background, like electricity. You don't think about it until it disappears. Then suddenly you realize how much depended on it. The same thing happens in relationships. The person who listened, the person who encouraged, the person who understood, the person who forgave, the person who stayed. Their absence creates a vacuum filled with questions. Why aren't they responding? Why don't they seem interested? Why don't they care anymore? The answer is often surprising. They still care. They simply care about themselves too. For perhaps the first time in a very long time. This distinction matters. Because cutting someone off is not always about hatred. Sometimes it is about preservation. Sometimes it is about survival. Sometimes it is about choosing peace. Many empaths reach a point where they realize something uncomfortable. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. You can understand someone completely and still decide they cannot remain in your life. You can love someone and still recognize they are unhealthy for you. You can forgive someone and still remove access. These ideas feel contradictory, but they are not. Forgiveness and access are different things. Understanding and tolerance are different things. Love and availability are different things. The empath eventually learns these distinctions. Once learned, they are difficult to forget. This is why reconnecting with someone after a true empath cutoff is often difficult. People assume the empath is being stubborn. The reality is usually deeper. The empath remembers every ignored boundary, every conversation, every disappointment, every attempt they made before reaching their decision. While others focus on the moment of separation, the empath remembers the entire journey, the entire accumulation, the entire pattern. That memory creates certainty, and certainty changes behavior. When uncertainty exists, people negotiate. When certainty exists, people act. The empath finally becomes certain. Certain that more waiting will not create change. Certain that more explaining will not create understanding. Certain that more sacrificing will not create reciprocity. Certain that remaining will only create more exhaustion. Certainty produces action. Action produces distance. Distance produces peace. And peace can become addictive. Not excitement, not drama, not emotional highs and lows. Peace. The absence of constant emotional labor. The absence of constant disappointment. The absence of constant responsibility for someone else's choices. The empath discovers what life feels like without carrying everyone, without rescuing everyone, without fixing everyone, without managing everyone. That experience is transformative. Energy returns. Confidence returns. Focus returns. Identity returns. The empath begins remembering who they were before the emotional burden consumed them. Many people never expect this transformation. They assume the empath will always remain available, always remain understanding, always remain patient, always remain accessible. Then they discover something important. Even the most compassionate person has limits. Every human being has limits. The empath simply reaches theirs later than most. When that limit arrives, the response is often misunderstood. People call it coldness. The empath calls it necessity. People call it abandonment. The empath calls it self-respect. People call it overreaction. The empath calls it accumulated reality. Perspective determines interpretation. What looks extreme from the outside often feels overdue from the inside, especially when nobody witnessed the internal struggle. Especially when nobody witnessed the emotional exhaustion. especially when nobody witnessed the countless chances already given. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming kindness equals infinite tolerance. It doesn't. Kindness is not weakness. Compassion is not surrender. Empathy is not permission. In fact, some of the strongest boundaries are created by the kindest people, because they understand something others don't. A boundary established early protects comfort. A boundary established late protects survival. The empath often waits too long. Then the boundary arrives all at once. The cutoff becomes the final boundary. Not because they enjoy it, because every smaller boundary failed. Every conversation failed. Every compromise failed. Every request failed. Eventually, stronger action becomes necessary. What makes this process fascinating psychologically is that people often react to the cutoff rather than the behavior that caused it. They focus on the symptom, not the cause. They focus on the departure, not the journey that led there. They focus on the silence, not the years of unheard communication. This creates confusion, because they are evaluating the final decision without evaluating the context. Context changes everything. Imagine a bridge carrying more weight every day. From a distance it appears stable. Then one day it collapses. People call the collapse sudden. Engineers call it cumulative stress. The empath functions similarly. The final moment is visible. The accumulated strain is invisible. But the invisible strain caused the visible outcome. This is why many empaths appear completely finished when they leave. Not wounded. Finished. The grieving happened beforehand. The processing happened beforehand. The acceptance happened beforehand. By the time they leave, much of the emotional work has already been completed. That reality surprises people, especially those expecting endless opportunities, endless forgiveness, endless patience, endless access. Access is valuable. Most people discover its value only after losing it. The empath understands this eventually. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your energy. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your time. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your emotional resources. Access should reflect behavior, not promises. Behavior. This realization changes relationships forever. The empath stops evaluating words. They start evaluating patterns. Patterns reveal everything. Someone's priorities, someone's intentions, someone's character, someone's level of investment. Patterns eliminate confusion, and confusion is often what keeps unhealthy relationships alive. The empath finally sees clearly. Clarity becomes freedom. Freedom becomes peace. Peace becomes non-negotiable. Once peace becomes non-negotiable, many old relationships can no longer survive. Not because the empath changed into someone new, because they stopped abandoning themselves to accommodate everyone else. That shift creates a completely different life. A life where boundaries exist. A life where reciprocity matters. A life where effort is mutual. A life where respect is required. A life where emotional labor is shared. And once someone experiences that reality, returning to old patterns feels impossible. The cutoff was never really about rejecting another person. It was about finally choosing themselves after years of choosing everyone else. It was about recognizing that understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their behavior. It was about recognizing that compassion without boundaries creates suffering. It was about recognizing that love without respect creates exhaustion. It was about recognizing that loyalty without reciprocity creates imbalance. It was about recognizing that every human being deserves relationships that nourish, rather than drain. And when an empath finally learns that lesson, the silence that follows is rarely revenge. It is relief. It is clarity. It is freedom. It is the sound of someone putting down a burden they carried far longer than they ever should. Ever.